Congratulations, you just declared war on the galaxy's deadliest species. The first thing Ambassador Claire Donovan said when the Vrethkai destroyed our probe was not a threat. It was not a speech. It was a single, quiet instruction to her aide, a young man named Owen Price, who had been with her for 3 years and had learned to recognize that particular tone of hers. Get me a secure line to Earth Command, right now. I was standing 6 feet away. I heard every word. My name is Nathan Cole, and I had been assigned to the Galactic Conclave as a junior diplomatic liaison for 11 months. I had spent most of that time learning how to bow correctly to species with 4 heads, memorizing the 47 distinct ways the Drethari express polite agreement, and trying not to stare at the Vrethkai when they entered a room. Everyone stared at the Vrethkai. You could not help it. They were enormous, 8 feet tall on average, covered in layered plates of dark biological armor that shifted slightly when they moved, like the surface of a disturbed lake. Their eyes were pale, almost white, and they had this way of looking at you that made you feel like something they had already categorized and dismissed. They were, by every measure the Conclave recognized, the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. They had been at the top of that particular list for 6,000 years. They were not shy about mentioning it. The probe they destroyed had been an unmanned scientific vessel. It was cataloging mineral deposits in the Velhari Reach, a stretch of unclaimed deep space that humanity had formally registered interest in 3 years prior. There were no weapons aboard. There was no crew. There was a small plaque near the navigation core with the names of the engineers who built her, the way humans have always put names on things they send into the dark. The Vrethkai delegate, a senior figure named Overlord Kroth, had announced the destruction in the middle of a full conclave session. He had not apologized. He had explained in the flat, unhurried tone of someone describing the weather that the Velhari Reach had been designated a Vrethkai expansion corridor 200 years ago, and that human presence there was an intrusion. The probe had been removed. He used the word removed, the way you would describe brushing dust from a table. The chamber held representatives from 61 recognized species. Not one of them said a word in our defense. A few looked at the human section of the chamber with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been relief that it was not them. Owen brought Claire the secure communicator. She spoke for less than 2 minutes, her voice low and steady. I caught fragments: fleet readiness status, confirmation of standing orders, authorization codes I did not have clearance to understand. Then she closed the line and turned to face me. Nathan, she said, I need you to draft a formal transmission to the Vrethkai. I will give you the exact text. I had my pad ready. She dictated 4 sentences. The first said that humanity formally held the Vrethkai government responsible for the unlawful destruction of registered human property in internationally recorded space. The second specified the value of the probe and demanded full reparations within 72 hours. The third was a single statement of consequence. It said that failure to comply would be treated as an act of aggression, and that humanity had already taken the appropriate first steps in response. The fourth sentence was the one that mattered. It said, "This is your only warning." I typed it, I read it back, I looked up at her. "Ambassador," I said, "they are going to think this is a joke." She looked at me calmly. "Yes," she said, "they are." She did not seem troubled by this. That was what stayed with me. Not the words, not the threat, not even the audacity of a species that had been in space for less than 300 years pointing a finger at an empire 6,000 years old. What stayed with me was the absolute absence of doubt in her face. I sent the transmission. The conclave did not laugh openly. They were too diplomatic for open laughter. But I spent the rest of that afternoon in the corridors and meeting rooms of the station, and I watched the way the other delegates moved and whispered and glanced toward the human section, and I understood that open laughter was simply the version of what was happening that had been polished to a more acceptable surface. Even the species who had reason to dislike the Vrethkai were not taking our side. The Drethari, Small and cautious traders who had lost 2 of their own colony rights to Vrethkai expansion in the past century, said nothing beyond a polite expression of concern for the situation. Their senior delegate, a compact figure named Voss who smelled faintly of copper and always wore the same gray coat, stopped me in the hallway near the eastern observation deck and tilted his head at the angle that meant genuine curiosity. "Your ambassador," he said. "Does she understand what she has just done?" "I believe so," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "My people have a phrase," he said. "It translates roughly as, 'Admire the brave ones from a distance.'" Then he walked away. The Vrethkai response to our transmission arrived in 40 minutes. That was faster than I expected. I thought it might mean they were taking us seriously. It did not mean that. Overlord Kroth's reply was 700 words. I will not reproduce all of it, but the substance was this. Humanity was a young and underdeveloped species, which the Conclave had generously chosen to classify at the 3rd developmental tier. We had shown, in Kroth's words, an endearing but dangerous misunderstanding of our position in the order of things. He recommended that we rescind the transmission, file a standard grievance through the Conclave's formal process, which he noted typically reached resolution within 40 to 60 years, and take some time to reflect on the wisdom of proportional ambition. He ended with a single line that was clearly meant to be the final word. "We do not negotiate with species who cannot threaten us." Owen read it over my shoulder. He was 26 years old and had grown up in a small coastal town in Wales. He had studied xenodiplomacy for 8 years and spoken 4 alien languages before he turned 25. He was not a man who startled easily. He read Kroth's closing line and let out a long breath through his nose. "Right," he said. "Well." I forwarded the response to Claire. She read it once. She set down her cup of tea. She pulled up the navigation display on her personal screen, the one that showed the real-time positions of vessels logged in Conclave-monitored space. She zoomed out to a wide field that covered the outer transit lanes. Then she pointed at a cluster of 17 signal markers moving in close formation through a region called the Outer Veil, approximately 4 days' travel from Conclave space. I did not recognize the vessel classifications at first. They were not standard military configuration. They were listed as heavy industrial transport and deep space survey class, but their formation was tight and deliberate in the way that cargo convoys never are, and their speed was higher than their listed classification should have allowed. "Those left Earth 3 days ago," Claire said. I stared at the screen. She had sent the transmission 40 minutes ago. The 72-hour clock was already running. The fleet had left Earth before the clock started, before the probe was even confirmed destroyed. "You knew," I said. "We knew they were going to do something eventually," she said. "The probe was just the first thing we had on record." She finished her tea. "This is not a reaction, Nathan. This has been a preparation." I stood there in the quiet of her office, watching 17 blips move steadily through the dark. Outside, somewhere in the main conclave chamber, Overlord Kroth was probably still enjoying his own wit. 60 other species were probably already forgetting that this had happened. Another small species had been put in its place. Everything was in order. The blips kept moving. I had read everything the conclave archives held about the Vrethkai. 6,000 years of dominance, 39 species absorbed or broken, a military doctrine built on the simple logic of absolute superiority, hit first, hit completely, allow no recovery. It had worked every single time. They had never needed to adapt it because no one had ever made them. I thought about something I had read once, in a very old human document, about what happens when a force that has only ever known one kind of opponent finally meets something it does not understand. The document had called it the problem of the unopened book. You cannot read what you have never opened. The 72 hours would end in 3 days. By then, those ships would be considerably closer. And Overlord Kroth, supreme commander of a 6,000-year empire, had just told the only species in the galaxy that runs toward things that scare them that he did not consider them a threat. I picked up my pad. I had reports to write and meetings to attend, and a great deal of very careful work ahead of me. But first I allowed myself exactly one moment to think about what was coming. Then I smiled just briefly and got back to work. The first report from the frontier came in on the 4th day. Overlord Kroth had not responded to Claire's transmission beyond his initial reply. The 72-hour window had passed. I had expected some kind of reaction from the conclave, a formal call for restraint, a motion for emergency mediation, anything. What I got instead was a very polite communication from the conclave session coordinator, explaining that the matter had been logged, that a preliminary review committee would be formed within the standard 8-week period, and that both parties were encouraged to pursue measured dialogue. 8 weeks. I filed the communication under a folder I had labeled, with perhaps more honesty than was professionally appropriate, things that will not help. Owen was already at his desk when I arrived that morning, which was unusual. He was an early riser, but not this early. He was also very still, which was more unusual. Owen was the kind of person who tapped his fingers and shifted in his chair and talked while he was reading. He was not talking now. He was staring at his screen with both hands flat on the desk. "The preliminary contact happened at 0300 our time," he said, without looking up. "Outer Vale, grid reference 77 Alpha. 3 Vrethkai patrol cruisers intercepted what they logged as an unauthorized convoy in their expansion corridor." I pulled up the report on my own screen, and "The convoy did not stop," Owen said. "The patrol cruisers issued standard warnings. The convoy kept moving. The patrol cruisers opened fire." I read ahead of what he was telling me. 1 Vrethkai cruiser was disabled. 1 was destroyed. The 3rd retreated and sent an emergency signal to the nearest Vrethkai regional command. Owen finally looked at me. "Those were not military vessels on the manifest, Nathan. They were classified as heavy industrial transports." "I know. Industrial transports do not fight back like that." "I know." He turned back to his screen. "The Vrethkai regional commander has requested clarification from the home command. Their after-action notation describes the human vessels as having used, and I am quoting here, improvised but effective weapons configurations inconsistent with the registered class of the vessels involved." Owen paused. "They are confused." That word, coming out of a Vrethkai military report, was remarkable enough that I read it twice just to make sure I had not misunderstood the translation. Confused. The Vrethkai were not accustomed to confusion in military encounters. Their doctrine was built on certainty. They were the strongest. They arrived. Things ended. There was no step between arrival and conclusion that involved the phrase improvised but effective. Within the hour, word had spread through the conclave. By mid-morning, there was not a single delegation that had not heard the initial report. By afternoon, when the second contact was confirmed, a Vrethkai supply station near the Reach's inner edge had been approached and formally demanded to stand down, and had refused, and had subsequently found itself without power, without communications, and very thoroughly outmaneuvered by vessels that had no business maneuvering the way they did. The mood in the conclave chambers had shifted from polite dismissal to something quieter and less easy to name. I walked those corridors carefully that day. I listened more than I spoke. I was good at that. It was most of what the job required. What I heard surprised me, not because it was hostile, it was not. What surprised me was the specific quality of the silence that surrounded each cluster of delegates when they saw me coming. It was not the silence of people waiting for a disaster. It was the silence of people who had been waiting for something for a very long time and were not quite sure yet whether this was it. The Vrethkai called an emergency session. They did not ask. They announced it, which was their standard mode of interaction with any institution they technically belonged to but considered beneath them. Croth himself appeared, which was not common. He usually sent subordinates to conclave sessions. His presence meant this had already crossed a threshold for them. He spoke for a long time. The substance of it was that humanity had committed an act of aggression against recognized Vrethkai territorial claims and Vrethkai vessels, that this was a matter for conclave disciplinary process, and that appropriate consequences would be applied. His tone was the tone of a man who had done this before, who had stood in this room and said words like these, and watched the room agree with him, because the room always agreed with him. Claire was present. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. She listened to the entire speech with the focused, neutral attention of someone who had already read the ending and was simply waiting for the rest of the text to catch up. When Croth finished, the session chair asked if the human delegation wished to respond. Claire stood up. She said 5 sentences. The first acknowledged that human vessels had engaged Vrethkai forces. The second noted that those forces had fired first. The third cited the specific conclave statute that affirmed a registered species' right to defend registered interests against unprovoked attack. The fourth reminded the chamber that the Velhari Reach had been formally registered by humanity 3 years prior, and that no Vrethkai counterclaim had been lodged within the required legal period. The fifth sentence was the one that changed the temperature of the room. "We are not here to ask for permission," Claire said. "We are here to inform you of what is already happening." She sat down. The session chair looked at Croth. Croth looked at Claire. The room was very quiet. I had spent 11 months watching the Vrethkai in that chamber. I had seen them dismiss, condescend, override, and occasionally simply ignore the proceedings when the topic did not interest them. I had never seen one of them look the way Croth looked at that moment. It was not anger, exactly. Anger I had seen from them plenty of times. It was something more specific. Something that required first understanding that the situation was not what you had assumed it was, and that the gap between your assumption and reality was wide enough that you were not sure how you had missed it. Claire had not asked for anything. She had not appealed. She had not petitioned. She had simply reported a fact. And the fact was that 17 ships had become 40, and 40 had become more, and they were not stopping, and they were not waiting, and they were not afraid. I know what fear looks like across 61 species. It does not always look the same. Some species freeze. Some become very loud. Some retreat into procedural language and committees and formal reviews, because process is the thing they reach for when reality becomes uncomfortable. But there is one thing that is almost universal. When something that has always been safe to ignore becomes something that cannot be ignored, there is a moment, brief, unmistakable, when the eyes change. I saw it in Croth's eyes that afternoon. He recovered quickly. He was experienced and disciplined and had survived 6,000 years of dominance by being very good at projecting certainty. He recovered and he spoke again, this time more sharply, and the session continued, and motions were filed and language was debated, and all the machinery of interstellar diplomacy kept turning. But I had seen the moment, and I knew, in the way you know things before you can prove them, that he had seen something in Claire that scared him, and that what scared him was not her words. It was the complete absence of anything in her that wanted his approval. The Vrethkai had built their empire on a simple truth. Every other species wanted something from them: recognition, safety, trade access, permission to exist without fear. Every negotiation, every confrontation, every relationship the Vrethkai had ever had was shaped by that truth. You could not threaten someone who had nothing to lose, but you also could not intimidate someone who did not want what you were withholding. We had not come to the conclave for their protection. We had not come looking for recognition. We had come because it was the right place to put what we had to say on the record. and we did not actually need them to agree. That night I sat in the small observation room near the eastern end of the station, the one with the long window that looked out at open space, and I thought about a thing that most species never have to think about because their history does not make it necessary. Humans had spent the first 100,000 years of their existence being hunted, eaten, outrun, outclimbed, outstrengthened. By nearly every measure of physical capability, they should not have survived. The creatures that shared their world were faster, stronger, and better armored. The planet itself was trying, in the way planets do without intention, to kill them at every turn. And humanity had responded to this by learning, by adapting, by refusing, generation after generation, to lie down. They had looked at every predator that hunted them and studied it until they understood it well enough to hunt it back. They had looked at every obstacle and found or invented a way through it. They had made tools and fire and medicine, and eventually rockets, and at no point in that entire long story had they sat down and decided it was time to stop. The Vrethkai had never fought anything that refused to stop. I watched the stars and I thought about what was moving through the dark out there, past where any of the Conclave's sensors could reach yet, closing the distance with the quiet patience of something that had already decided how this would end. Then I went to bed, because there was a great deal of work still to do, and I have always found it easier to face large things when I am not tired. The war, by the time the Conclave officially acknowledged it as such, had already been running for 3 months. 3 months is not long by the standards of interstellar conflict. The Vrethkai had waged campaigns that lasted centuries. Their recorded military history described engagements that spanned entire generations, slow, grinding advances and retreats measured in decades. They were patient. They were thorough. They had the infrastructure of a 6,000-year empire behind every operation, endless supply chains, and established logistics networks and regional command structures that had been tested and refined across 39 prior conflicts. 3 months in, they were winning nearly every engagement. I want to be precise about that because it matters. When people talk about what happened in the Velhari campaign, there is a tendency to tell it in a way that makes it sound clean, as though humanity simply showed up and reversed the natural order. That is not what happened. What happened was harder and slower and more costly than that, and anyone who tells you otherwise was not watching closely enough. 3 months in, the Vrethkai had more ships. They had better shields. Their weapons had longer effective range and higher yield. They had the enormous practical advantage of fighting in and around space they had operated in for generations, space they had mapped and mined, and seeded with infrastructure we did not know existed until we ran into it. They won most of the direct engagements in those first months. Not all of them, but most. What they could not do was make a stop. That was the detail their commanders kept nodding and could not explain. Owen showed me the intercepted reports. We had broken the first Vrethkai encryption layer by week 6, which their intelligence division did not discover until week 10. And I read them carefully because I believed they revealed something essential about the shape of the conflict. The phrase that appeared most often, across commanders and theaters and time periods, was some variation of, "Forces continue to engage despite unsustainable losses." They thought we were irrational. It is an understandable error. In every previous conflict in their history, a rational opponent reached a point of calculation. You measured your remaining strength against the opposition. If the math said you could not win, you found a way to stop. That was not cowardice. That was sense. Every species they had ever fought had done it eventually. The math always arrived, and rational beings always listened to it. What they had not encountered before was a species whose math included variables they were not measuring. I was in Claire's office when we got the report from the Kelevar station. I remember it clearly because I had been arguing with her for the better part of an hour about something I now realize was a very small thing. The convoy commander at Kelevar, a practical and plainly stubborn man named Gregory Hart, had been encircled by a Vrethkai force 3 times the size of his own. Communications had been interrupted. Supply lines had been cut. The Vrethkai commander had sent a formal demand for surrender and had given Hart 4 hours to respond. Hart's response, when it came, was not a communication. It was a tactical action. The details are complicated, and I am not an engineer, but the short version is this. Hart's team had been studying the power distribution architecture of their own vessels for 2 weeks, ever since the encirclement began. They had identified a way to reconfigure the reactor output of 3 ships in close formation to generate a directed energy pulse. It was not something any textbook had described. It was not something the ships had been designed to do. It was not something the Vrethkai models had any entry for, because you cannot model a possibility you have not imagined. The 3 ships were lost in the process. Every person aboard knew that was likely when they volunteered for it. I am not going to describe what happened to the Vrethkai fleet that had been holding the perimeter. I will say that the encirclement ended, that Gregory Hart brought the rest of his convoy through, and that the after-action report he filed was 11 pages long and written in the direct, slightly irritable style of a man who had not slept in 4 days and had strong opinions about inefficient supply routing. The last line of his report said, "Request additional reactor shielding components for future operations. The current configuration presents an unnecessary bottleneck." He was already thinking about next time. That report reached the Vrethkai High Command through channels I will not specify. I know it reached them because we intercepted their response. Their senior strategic analyst described the Kelevar engagement as anomalous and recommended it be classified as an outlier resulting from exceptional individual decisions unlikely to be replicated at scale. He was wrong, of course, but I understood why he thought that. The mistake he made was in how he defined exceptional. He meant it as a statistical deviation. He was thinking about it as a rare event. What he did not understand was that Hart was not exceptional by human standards. Hart was a cargo convoy commander with a logistics background and an engineering degree he had finished at night school while working his first deep space route. He was competent, experienced, and deeply unwilling to accept a situation he had not first tried to change. By Vrethkai standards, that profile would have been remarkable. By human standards, it described about 40% of our fleet commanders. We did not produce exceptional people who did impossible things. We produced ordinary people who did not recognize the word impossible as a full stop. The conclave was watching all of this with the careful, slightly stunned attention of a group of spectators who had bought tickets to a predictable event and found themselves watching something entirely different. I spent a significant amount of time in those months having conversations that I had not anticipated having, with delegates from species that had previously been too cautious or too comfortable to express any view on the Vrethkai that could be described as critical. Voss, the Drethari delegate, began appearing in spaces where I also happened to be. It was not accidental. Drethari do not do anything accidentally. He would stand near me at the long observation windows and look out at space and talk about trade routes, about the challenges of deep space mineral extraction, about the theoretical logistics of supplying a fleet operating at extended range. He never said anything directly. He was too experienced for that. But what he was communicating, underneath the careful language, was this. The Drethari had been watching the Vrethkai expand for a century, and they had a great many resources that needed a reliable and discreet destination. 3 other species made similar overtures through similar indirection. None of them wanted to be seen as aligned with us. That was too dangerous while the outcome was still uncertain, but they were positioning themselves, very carefully, for the possibility that the outcome might not go the way everyone had assumed. I brought all of this to Claire. She listened, took notes, and then said something that I have thought about many times since. "Do not promise them anything yet," she said, "and do not let them think we need them. The moment they believe we need them, they will start charging for it. She was right. I knew she was right. But it was not easy in those months to hold that line, because the truth was that we did have costs. The truth was that there were names on lists I tried not to look at too often, people who had gone out and not come back, and the numbers were real and they were not small. We were building capacity as fast as we could, repurposing and retrofitting and innovating at a pace that impressed even our own engineers. But impressive pace is not the same as painless. I remember one evening, around the 4th month, sitting with Owen in the small corner of the station's shared cafeteria that had, by a kind of unspoken agreement, become the space where the human staff went when they needed to not be performing composure for other species. It was just the two of us. He had a cup of something the station's food system called coffee, which resembled coffee in the way that a photograph of fire resembles warmth. "My brother is out there," he said, not looking at me. I did not know what to say to that. I said nothing. Sometimes that is the right answer. He drank the not coffee. "He is fine," Owen added, with the specific confidence of someone who needs to believe something and is choosing, deliberately, to believe it. I nodded. We sat quietly for a while. "The Vrethkai Psychic Division broadcast another fear signal last week," Owen said eventually. "Did you read the crew response reports?" I did. 11 seconds, he said. Average measurable fear response across 6 ships, 11 seconds, and then every single report says essentially the same thing. Personnel describe moving from fear to anger and then to focus. One gunner's report actually uses the phrase, "got annoyed and decided to do something about it." He looked at me. His expression was somewhere between exhausted and quietly proud. "We are genuinely strange, Nathan," he said. "Yes," I said, "we really are." The Vrethkai did not stop trying. That was important. They adjusted tactics, deployed additional forces, attempted economic pressure through conclave channels that went nowhere because we had not built our economy around conclave trade networks. They were a serious, capable, disciplined empire, and they were doing everything their 6,000 years of experience told them to do. None of it was working the way it should. And then, in the 5th month, Overlord Kroth sent a new kind of transmission. Not to humanity, he sent it to the conclave. He requested formal mediation. I read the transmission 3 times. Then I went directly to Claire's office without stopping to knock. She had already read it. She was standing at her window, looking out at the stars. "They want to talk," I said. "Yes." "Do you want to talk?" She turned around. "We will talk when they return what they destroyed, every gram of it." She paused. "Go draft the response." I went. Somewhere in the corridor, I passed Voss. He looked at me with those small, copper-dark eyes. He made the angle that in Drethari expression means the recognition of a significant moment. "Progress," he said. "Something like that," I said. He nodded once, then he walked on. The second phase of the talks began in what the conclave diplomatically called a structured dialogue process, and what I called, in my private notes, the part where everyone pretends they have been reasonable all along. The Vrethkai came to the table, which was a figurative table, a series of relay-mediated communication exchanges across a neutral channel, with a posture that was new for them. Not humble, exactly. The Vrethkai were not constitutionally capable of humble, but there was a quality to their opening statements that I had not seen from them before, a kind of careful measurement in every word, as though they were speaking in a room with a low ceiling and had learned recently not to stand up too fast. My name is Nathan Cole. I was a junior diplomatic liaison when this started. By the time the dialogue process began, I had a new title that nobody had bothered to invent yet, so we called it Senior Field Coordinator, which meant I was the person who stayed up late cross-referencing interception, reports with official transmission logs and briefing Claire at 6 in the morning. I was also, I realized somewhere in the 7th month, beginning to understand something about the Vrethkai that their own history had never made necessary for them to understand about themselves. They did not know how to want something without it looking like weakness. Their entire culture, every social structure and diplomatic posture and military protocol, was built on the assumption of dominance. You communicated from a position of strength. You asked for nothing because asking implied that you lacked something, and lacking something implied vulnerability, and vulnerability was the first thing an opponent would exploit. This was not a flaw in their character so much as a logical product of 6,000 years of always being the strongest thing in the room. The problem was that it left them with no vocabulary for the situation they were in now. They could not simply say what they wanted, because saying it directly would mean acknowledging that they wanted it, and wanting it meant not having it, and not having it meant the situation had changed from what it was supposed to be. So they talked around it. They proposed frameworks. They suggested mutual reviews of territorial claims. They raised the question of a conclave-supervised demilitarized corridor. Every proposal was structured to look like a generous offer from a position of choice rather than a request from a position of need. And every proposal, without exception, contained the same hidden center. They wanted the humans to stop. Claire recognized it immediately. She had a gift for reading the architecture of language, for finding the load-bearing walls inside a sentence. She sat through 17 sessions of opening dialogue without agreeing to a single framework, and she did it in a way that was never provocative, never rude, and never gave them anything they could point to as obstruction. She was simply waiting. I asked her once, late in the 8th month, what she was waiting for. For them to say the real thing, she said. What is the real thing? That they are afraid, she said. Not of us specifically, of what we represent, of the fact that we exist and we are not stopping and they do not have an answer for that. She set down her pen. The moment they say that, even around the edges, the conversation changes, because then we are talking about the actual problem instead of all the formal furniture they have been stacking around it. The actual battle that changed the temperature came not from a diplomatic session, but from a place called the Margith Relay, a Vrethkai communications and supply hub in the midpoint of their primary expansion route. It was not a dramatic target. It was practical. Our strategic planning team, led by a quiet, extremely methodical woman named Alice Ford, had spent 4 months identifying every node in the Vrethkai logistics network that, if disrupted, would create cascading supply failures across multiple theaters. The Margith Relay was the third on that list. It fell in 41 hours. The approach was careful and thoroughly planned. Alice Ford's team had mapped the relay's patrol patterns over 11 weeks using data gathered from previous engagements and from the Drethari, who had, by this point, stopped pretending their material assistance was purely economic. The force that took the relay was not the largest human formation in the field. It was chosen for precision rather than power. They arrived in a formation the Vrethkai did not have a defensive protocol for, because the protocol would have required imagining that someone would try it, and the Vrethkai strategic imagination had been shaped entirely by encounters with species that did not move the way we did. The relay's commander sent an emergency request for reinforcement. The reinforcement was intercepted and redirected by a second group operating on a parallel timeline that the relay's command had not known existed. The operation had 3 moving parts that needed to function simultaneously at distances of several light minutes. Which sounds impressive until you learn that the planning team had run the coordination model 400 times before they were satisfied with it. Alice Ford's after-action summary was 2 pages. The last paragraph noted 6 areas for improvement in future coordinated operations. She was already working on the next one. When the Margith Relay fell, 5 other supply chains went into disruption. The effects were not immediate, but they were certain, and the Vrethkai High Command knew it. Within the week, 3 regional commanders had filed independent assessments to the Home Command that all said, in different ways, the same thing. This is not what we thought it was. I want to dwell on that for a moment, because it is easy to tell this story in a way that makes it look inevitable, and it was not inevitable. What happened to the Vrethkai was not that they were defeated by a superior force. They were not. In raw material terms, they remained formidable throughout. What happened was that they encountered something their experience had never prepared them for, and their experience was so vast and so consistent that it had become, without them realizing it, a kind of blindness. Every species they had ever fought had a breaking point that looked the same, a moment when the cost became too high and the goal became unreachable, and the only remaining question was the terms of ending. They knew what that moment looked like. They had seen it 39 times. They had learned to identify the early indicators, the subtle changes in engagement patterns that signaled a species approaching its limit. They kept looking for those indicators in us. They kept adjusting their models to account for why the indicators had not appeared yet. The adjustments became more elaborate over time, more hedged with caveats, more dependent on assumptions that required the next engagement to behave differently than the last one had. The indicators never appeared. Not because we were invincible, not because the cost was not real, but because the thing they were looking for, the moment when a species decides that continuing is no longer worth it, required a particular relationship to loss that humans simply did not have. We did not experience loss as a signal to stop. We experienced it as information. We learned from it. We adjusted. We came back with a different approach. We had been doing this for 100,000 years, on a planet that was actively hostile, against opponents that were physically superior to us in almost every way. We had been doing it so long and so consistently that it had become structural, woven into the way our minds worked at a level below conscious decision. The Vrethkai were looking for a breaking point in a species that had been forged, over millennia, specifically to not break. The psychic broadcast came in the 9th month. It was the Vrethkai's most significant non-conventional weapon, something they had used to decisive effect in 2 prior campaigns. Their psychic division, a corps of highly trained biological signal emitters, could generate a coordinated fear response in the nervous systems of any sentient species they had encountered. The effect was not subtle. It was designed to produce in the target a profound and immediate sense that resistance was pointless, that danger was overwhelming, that the most rational available action was to yield. It worked on every human on every ship in range of the broadcast. For 11 seconds, I read the reports, 47 separate crew logs from across the affected formation. They all described the same sequence. A sudden and overwhelming wave of fear, intense and physical, the kind that comes from the oldest part of a nervous system. Then, in every single account, without a single exception, the same thing happened next. The fear turned. Not into calm, not into courage in the composed, decided sense. It turned into something more animal than that, something that 100,000 years of surviving on a hostile planet had built into the architecture of human biology. The threat signals fired, the fear response triggered, and then the older system, the one that had evolved because sometimes the thing trying to eat you could be hit back, took over. One crew member's log described it as, "I was scared, and then I was furious and I stopped being scared." Another wrote, "It felt like someone grabbed my arm, so I hit them." A gunnery crew filed a joint report that said in its entirety, "Registered a threat signal, identified source direction, engaged." The Psychic Division commander's report to the Vrethkai Home Command was the most unsettled document I read in the entire war. He described a weapon that had never failed him. He described deploying it with full confidence. He described the 11 seconds of measurable effect. And then he described, with the precise and slightly disbelieving language of a scientist whose experiment has returned an impossible result, what came after. "The subjects," he wrote, "appear to have a conditioned response that converts threat stimuli into aggression rather than avoidance. This is not a defensive adaptation in the conventional sense. It is an offensive one. The fear response in this species does not produce withdrawal, it produces attack. He recommended discontinuing use of the broadcast against human forces on the grounds that it was producing adverse outcomes. He was right to recommend it. The conclave was very quiet when the 9th-month report circulated. I watched the chamber. I watched the delegates from 61 species process what they were learning. I watched Voss, who processed it the fastest and said the least. I watched a delegate from a species called the Morthine, large and very old, and generally considered the most neutral observers in the conclave, who had said almost nothing for the entire preceding months, and who now sat very still with an expression I did not have a clear translation for. I walked over to him after the session. His name was Senior Observer Kale, and he had been attending conclave sessions for longer than most human nations had existed. I asked him, because I was tired and because I thought he would tell me something honest, what he was thinking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We have been watching the Vrethkai for 4,000 years. In that time, we have never seen them ask for help." "They have not asked for help," I said. "They requested mediation." "Yes," Kale said, "that is what I said." He turned and walked away. The formal turning point, the moment that the conclave would eventually record as the decisive shift, came with the fall of the Vrethkai's regional command hub at the Selhari crossing. I will not describe the engagement in detail, because it has been described elsewhere and I was not present for it. What I can describe is the moment the battle data arrived at the conclave station, because I was there for that. It was late in the station's artificial night cycle. Most of the conclave was not in session. Owen and I were in the communication suite, tracking the relay reports as they came in. The engagement at Selhari had been projected to last several days. It lasted 11 hours. When the final status report came through, Owen read it once. Then he read it again. Then he turned to me with an expression that I will remember for the rest of my life. Not joy exactly, not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated than either. "The hub is ours," he said. "The Vrethkai fleet is in full retreat." Full retreat. 6,000 years, 39 conflicts, 0 prior retreats recorded in full disorder. We sat there for a moment. The communication suite hummed around us. Space was outside the window, silent and enormous. "Right," Owen said at last. "I suppose we had better tell Claire." The peace was not a clean thing. I want to say that clearly before anything else. The negotiations that followed the fall of Selhari were long and detailed and frequently exhausting, and the document that came out of them was not a simple victory statement. It was a complicated, carefully worded agreement with provisions and timelines and review clauses and a verification protocol that the conclave's legal division took 6 weeks to format properly. I was in almost every session. My name is Nathan Cole. I am not a hero of this story. I am the person who took notes, drafted language, caught contradictions in proposed clauses at 2 in the morning, and occasionally reminded very senior people on both sides that certain things had already been agreed 3 sessions ago and did not need to be re-argued. I want to tell you about the end honestly, not the way it gets told when it is already in the past and has already become something clean and symbolic, the way it actually was. Claire Donovan sat across from the Vrethkai delegation for 31 sessions over the course of 3 months. The lead Vrethkai negotiator was not Kroth. Kroth was gone from the public record by the 2nd month of talks, replaced by a senior diplomat named First Voice Seville, who was, I noted immediately, fundamentally different in her approach. She did not posture. She did not use the language of dominance that had characterized every prior Vrethkai interaction I had witnessed. She was direct and precise and occasionally, in the careful way of someone who had been given a new and difficult assignment and intended to do it properly, even willing to say when a proposal was fair. It took 8 sessions before I understood why Claire had waited for this. Seville was the internal signal that the Vrethkai Home Command had accepted the reality of the situation. You do not send a diplomat who speaks plainly when you are still trying to perform superiority. You send that diplomat when you need to actually reach an agreement. The terms were detailed, and I will not list every provision, but the center of them was this: full reparations for the destroyed probe, and for every registered human installation that had been targeted during the conflict, withdrawal of all Vrethkai claims to the Velhari Reach and 3 adjacent sectors that had been contested, and a formal conclave reclassification of humanity's developmental status. That last part took the longest to negotiate. Not because the Vrethkai resisted it, they were, by that point, genuinely prepared to concede, but because the conclave's classification system had not been designed with any expectation that a species would need to be placed somewhere entirely outside the existing categories. Class 3 emerging, Class 2 developing, Class 1 established. Class Prime, which was where the Vrethkai sat, the designation for a species considered a foundational power in the current galactic order. None of these fit. The Conclave's Classification Committee, after 6 weeks of discussion, proposed a new designation. I will not attempt to reproduce the original alien term because it does not translate cleanly, but the closest rendering into human language is something like independently defined. The meaning of it, as explained in the formal record, was this: a species whose development and conduct falls outside the parameters of the existing tier system, and which is therefore recognized as operating according to its own defined standards rather than those of any established classification. In practical terms, it meant, we do not fully understand you, and we are choosing to be honest about that rather than file you somewhere that does not fit. I thought that was, honestly, the most accurate thing the Conclave had said about us in the entire time I had worked there. There were things that happened during the negotiations that I found harder to sit with than the official record reflects. There was a session in the 6th week where a territorial timeline was being reviewed, and the Vrethkai delegation presented data on the 12 human installations in the outer reach that had been destroyed in the first month of the conflict. It was presented as part of the reparations calculation, a line-by-line accounting of material loss. The numbers were correct. The material value had been calculated accurately. What the numbers did not carry was the weight of the names, and the names were real, and some of them were people I had met. I kept my expression neutral. I took notes. I did not look at Owen, who was sitting next to me. After the session, we walked back through the corridor without speaking. Near the observation window, Owen stopped. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "My brother came back." "I know," I said. "I saw the update." "Yeah." We stood there for another moment. "He is different," Owen said. "His messages are different. He does not say anything specific, but you can tell." "I know," I said again. This is the part of the story that gets left out when it becomes a story. The difference between the people who left and the people who came back, and the question of whether that difference was permanent, and the longer, quieter conflict of figuring out how to live inside what had happened. I am not equipped to resolve that question in these pages. I do not think it can be resolved quickly. I think it is the kind of thing that takes a very long time and a great deal of patience from everyone involved. And I think humans are, on the whole, capable of that patience because we have had to be before. The Vrethkai signed the final agreement on a day that was, on the station's calendar, an unremarkable Tuesday. The ceremony was formal and brief. Claire signed for humanity. Seville signed for the Vrethkai Empire. The conclave session chair recorded the agreement in the formal register. There were no celebrations in the chamber itself. It was not that kind of moment. Afterward, in the long corridor outside the main chamber, a young Vrethkai diplomat approached me. He was younger than most of the delegation, which meant he had not been part of the original aggression. He was a generation removed from all of it, assigned to this role because the Empire needed people who could work in the new context it found itself in. His name, rendered into something I could pronounce, was something like Ren. I will call him that. He stopped me politely. He spoke through his translator in the careful, even way of someone choosing words very deliberately. "I have a question," he said, "if you do not mind." "Go ahead," I said. "How did you know you would win?" I thought about that honestly. I thought about the 17 blips on Claire's screen, 3 days before the warning was even sent. I thought about Gregory Hart filing improvement requests from the middle of an engagement that should have ended him. I thought about Alice Ford running her model 400 times. I thought about 11 seconds and what came after 11 seconds. I thought about Owen's brother and the messages that were different now and the weight of names in a reparations document. "We did not know," I said. "Not at the start, not in the middle either, honestly." Ren looked at me steadily. "Then why did you continue?" "Because knowing you will win is not the same as being willing to keep going," I said. "We knew we were going to keep going. That was the only thing we knew for certain." He considered that for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked away. I watched him go, and I thought he was going to need to think about that for a while, and that thinking about it would probably teach him something useful. 3 days after the agreement was signed, a new colony ship departed from Earth. I saw the launch report come through on Owen's screen while we were working through the post-agreement documentation that needed to be filed with the Conclave Registry. He turned the screen so I could see it. It was a big ship, larger than anything we had sent out before, built during the conflict and finished after it, designed for extended range and carrying everything needed to establish a full settlement at its destination. 4,200 people aboard. Their destination was a system well past the Velhari reach, past the sectors we had just finished negotiating for, into space that no registered species had mapped yet. I looked at the manifest. The crew was a cross-section of practically everything: engineers, doctors, teachers, farmers, builders, scientists, and people who had simply decided that they wanted to go further than anyone had gone before and were willing to do the work of getting there. The average age was 31. A significant portion of them had been born after humanity first made contact with the Conclave. They had grown up knowing that the galaxy was full. They were going anyway. The launch report included a brief pilot's log from the ship's commander, a woman named Laura Shaw who had spent 12 years on deep space routes and who described the moment of departure in 3 sentences. She said the engines were running clean. She said the course was set. She said the crew were in good spirits and ready for what was ahead. That was all. No speech, no declaration, just a statement of readiness and a heading. I thought about the conclave chamber and the way it had looked when this all started. The 61 delegations who had watched with polite amusement as a small, young species tried to tell the most powerful empire in the galaxy that there would be consequences. The silence that followed the first engagement reports. The look in Kroth's eyes when he understood, perhaps for the first time in his career, that he was talking to something he did not have a framework for. I thought about what we had cost ourselves to get here, and about the fact that even now, even with the ink barely dry on the agreement, there were already new questions. A power vacuum in the outer sectors. Species that had been waiting to see which way the wind blew and were now beginning to reposition. A galaxy that had been organized around one kind of order for 6,000 years and was going to have to figure out what it was organized around now. None of that was solved. None of it was simple. The agreement was not an ending. It was, if anything, a beginning of a longer and more complicated chapter. And 4,200 people were heading toward unmapped space, and their commander had filed 3 sentences, and every one of those sentences said, "We know there is work ahead, and we are ready for it." Senior Observer Kale found me on the observation deck that evening. He moved slowly and deliberately, the way the Morthine always do, and he stood beside me at the window for a while before he spoke. "Your species," he said, has been in formal contact with the conclave for less than 300 years. Yes, I said. And in that time, he said, you have done what no species has done in 4,000 years of this institution's operation. We got lucky, I said. He made a sound that I believe was the morphine equivalent of a quiet laugh. No, he said. Luck is when circumstances align in your favor despite the odds. What you did was different. You changed what the odds were measuring. He was quiet for a moment. We have been waiting for someone to do that for a very long time. I did not know what to say to that. I looked at the stars. What happens now? I asked. Now, Cale said, the galaxy has to decide what kind of place it wants to be, with you in it and not going away. He paused. That will be a longer conversation. We are good at long conversations, I said. No, he said with quiet precision. You are good at not stopping before the conversation is finished. That is not the same thing, but it is, I think, the more important quality. He left. I stayed at the window for a while. The ship carrying 4,200 people was already out of sensor range. It was moving steadily toward space that had no name yet, toward systems that had never been visited, toward everything that was still unknown and waiting. There is a thing that humans do that I have never been able to fully explain to any of the 61 species I have worked with in my time at the Conclave. It is not aggression, exactly. It is not ambition, exactly. It does not have a single clean word. It is the specific feeling of looking at something vast and uncertain and unknown, and instead of calculating whether to approach it, simply wanting to know what is in it. Not needing to, not being required to, wanting to. Every frontier we have ever had, we have walked toward it, not because we knew what was on the other side, not because we were confident we would be safe, because the question of what was there was, to us, more compelling than the question of whether it was dangerous. We have always been like this. We were like this before we had fire. We were like this before we had ships. We were like this when the most advanced technology we possessed was a sharp rock and an understanding of wind direction. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years building an order based on who was most powerful, who could strike hardest, who could hold the most space. It was a logical order, given the assumptions that built it. It made perfect sense if you assumed that the only things worth measuring were force and fear. We had shown them in 18 months of unglamorous, costly, grinding, inventive, stubborn, absolutely relentless effort that they had been measuring the wrong things. Not because we were stronger. Because we were curious. Because we were adaptable. Because we learned from every failure and came back different. Because the moment something scared us, we wanted to understand it, and understanding it, we wanted to solve it. And solving it, we found ourselves somewhere further than we had been before. Because we had been doing all of that, on a difficult planet, for a very long time. The stars were very still outside the window. Somewhere out there, Laura Shaw's ship was moving through the dark, 4,200 people carrying everything needed to build something new in a place that had no name yet. They were not afraid. They were exactly the way humans always are when pointed at something vast and unknown. They were curious. And they were not stopping.